This next recording is the beginning looking at the four main interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation. This first one looking at the historicist approach and the preterist approach. So, after looking at all the background of the book and the BRI work, we can now actually start to look at these different approaches, these different views of Revelation. Firstly, I want to show you how they fit into the book as a whole. The book roughly divides up into 1 to 3, 4 to 19, chapter 20 on its own, and then 21 to 22. These four main views, or these four main interpretive approaches, they mostly affect the main body of the letter, from 4 to 19. 1 to 3 can be affected by these views, but not all of them. And then there's a slight overlap with chapter 20, but with chapter 20 there are four distinct new views. Like I said, there's a slight overlap with one or two of these, with one of these. Mostly, it's four brand new views just for chapter 20 alone. And then when you get to 21 to 23, you have three new views which are just about that section of the book. But these main four views which I'll be talking about really for the rest of these recordings are mostly about this large section 4 to 19, the main body of the letter. So, the four views are the historicist approach, the idea of this being that Revelation is being fulfilled throughout church history. So that Revelation, if you like, is an overview of all of church history. The preterist view, which is that Revelation was fulfilled shortly after the time of writing. So Revelation has happened, or mostly all happened. Future, that Revelation is to be fulfilled in the future, so it mostly has not happened yet. Idealist, that Revelation has no single fulfillment in history, but its themes apply to all ages. It is timeless. It's like, this is what will always happen. And that's the pattern we're going to follow from now on. Historicist, preterist, futurist, idealist. So looking at first at the historicist approach. The key to this is this idea that Revelation is being fulfilled throughout history. So it's a prophetic overview given to John of all of church history. For the historicists, symbols, visions, things that happen within the book represent things that will happen in history, historical events that have close association with the church. So, for example, the locust plague for them represents the rise of Islam and its attack on the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. So for them, the seals, the trumpets, the bowls represent other types of events in history, like the reign of Constantine the Great, like the fall of Rome, like the fall of Constantinople, the Reformation, the French Revolution, and so on. It has to be said, it's very rare nowadays to find contemporary commentaries that support this view. You will see it on some of the classic, well-read commentaries of the past few centuries, and it apparently does still have a small following, but it's very rare to have new material written on historicist approach today. Though even though it's not popular today, if you look on the PowerPoint at the short list of some of the people who have held to this approach, it's a very impressive list. People like Wycliffe, Tyndale, Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, Knox, and so on. And then later on, Spurgeon, Matthew Henry, Charles Finney. These great men of God have held to the historicist view when it comes to Revelation. So I think that list on its own should stop us from dismissing this view out of hand, even though it doesn't have a great following today. In fact, up until the 19th century, this was generally known as the Protestant view of Revelation. Most of the Protestant church were historicists. So, for historical reasons, we shouldn't dismiss the historicist approach. It's part of our heritage, and we should look at it as a legitimate approach to Revelation, even though today it's not followed with such zeal. One of the underlying principles of interpretation involved in this approach, which is in fact unique to it, is this idea of a year for a day principle. The idea being that the time elements within Revelation are symbolic and exact at the same time, not literal. So, one day represents 1 year, and so on. So they are exact numbers, but the days are symbols of years. So following this system, the 5 months of the locusts is in fact 150 years. 1,260 days are 1,260 days. An hour, a day, and a month, and a year are 396 years and 106 days, give or take. Now they get this idea from Ezekiel 4. This is where you may remember in Ezekiel where Yahweh instructs Ezekiel to lie on his left side for 390 days and then on his right side for 40 days. And these single days represent years of judgment decreed upon Israel and Judah. What the historicists then do is take this what Yahweh instructed Ezekiel and then apply it to other prophecies, especially from books like Daniel and Revelation. So using this principle, the historicists will attempt to match up specific events in history with the details of John's vision using John's timing. As you might imagine, there's a lot of conjecture, a lot of guessing involved in this. But occasionally they do come up with some very intriguing successes. A famous example of this happened in 1690 AD. The historicist Robert Fleming was asked by King William III of England when the temporal power of the papacy or the papal system in Europe will fall. So when will the Pope's political power in Europe fall? William III, as a Protestant king, was obviously concerned about this, as most of his enemies were Catholic countries. So he was looking to when the power of the Pope in Europe would fall, which would be a good thing for the Protestant nation. Robert Fleming then looked at Revelation, and from his study, he concluded that the fall of the Pope's political power in Europe would begin in 1794 and end in 1848, which I suppose may have disappointed the king, because he's about a century away than he wanted. But interestingly enough, if you look at the events of European history for those dates, you get these intriguing parallels. 1794 saw the beginning of the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France. And one of the main targets of this time in French history was the Catholic Church in France. Up until that point, France had been the most powerful Catholic nation in Europe. Therefore, if you like, the Pope's most powerful ally in Europe. But in revolutionary France, the power of the Catholic Church in France was crippled. And so the Pope's power began to decline. This, of course, then led to the rise of Napoleon, which broke the Pope's power which broke Catholic nations all over Europe, therefore further diminishing the Pope's influence. And 1848 actually saw the Pope driven temporarily out of Rome. So again, you have these two dates and these intriguing successes. Now, you may have noticed that all is focused on the Pope and the Catholic Church. And this is huge in this view, since one of the non-negotiables in classical Protestant historicism is that the papal system is the Antichrist. This is because this view grew out of opposition to the Pope's power and the corruption within the Church. It was first argued, like we've seen on that list, by the great reformers of the Protestant tradition. So right from the start, this was an anti-Catholic view. Or I suppose more accurately, you should say, this was an anti-Pope, anti-Church establishment view. Not necessarily against Catholics, but those who led Catholics, those who led the Catholic Church, the Pope and those around him. And because of this, historicists are accused of being in a theological straitjacket. For them, the Pope is the enemy. That's non-negotiable. And because of that, they are seen as trying to force Revelation to speak against the Pope and the system of the papal system for their own partisan reasons. So for them, Revelation is a defense of Protestantism against Catholicism rather than the letter of encouragement, hope, and building up to the seven churches. In turn, historicists would argue that the other views are in fact satanically inspired distractions that obscure the identity of the true Antichrist, the Pope, the papal system. In fact, they claim that modern preterism and modern futurism were invented by the Jesuits to neutralize the bad publicity the Pope received from the reformers. So that they, them, are kind of apologetics. Their views are also apologetics for the Catholic Church. One of the strengths of this view is this remarkable link it has between Revelation and Roman history up to about the 15th century AD. In fact, many have said that in order to study Revelation, you have the Revelation in one hand, and you should also have Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the other, to make sense of Revelation. And even those who are the most steadfast, I suppose, detractors of this view, they would all say that nobody translates or interprets, the fifth and sixth trumpet like the historicists. Nobody gets anywhere near as good as an interpretation as they do. Apparently, the links between the rise in Islam and the Turkish conquest of the Byzantine Empire and the fifth and sixth trumpet are very, very uncanny. Very, very close links, even down to the color of the uniforms that the Turks wore when they attacked the city of Constantinople. So they say, even the people who really, really don't like this view will say, we admit you interpret the fifth and sixth trumpet the best of all of us. Though, of course, it has many problems. Not least its claim that the largest branch of the church is run by the Antichrist. Other weaknesses include that its followers don't seem to all agree on which points correspond with which historical events. In reality, you don't really have one view here, you have many views in one, because the historicists will point to different parts of history to correspond with different parts of Revelation. Another obvious criticism is that time is still going on. The church is still making history. The church is still a part of history. Where can it all fit in this book? Most historicists through history have thought that the book was nearly fulfilled in their own time. But decades, centuries later, we still haven't got to chapter 21. Also, its focus is far too narrow. It's only really concerned with the Mediterranean world and Europe in the Middle Ages in particular. It doesn't have much to say of the events after the 16th century, and basically ignores the history of the church in the continent of Asia, Africa, the Americas, and so on. And really, what relevance would all this be to these 7 churches in Asia? It isn't much of a reassurance to say that their persecutors will be destroyed after a few centuries, but then actually their persecutors will actually take over their own church and then persecute them for another 1,000 years before they break free and have a war with that church, and then eventually their persecutors will be destroyed. What much of a reassurance is that to these churches? Moving on to the preterist view. This approach sees Revelation as being fulfilled in the past. The main starting point for preterists is the dating of the letter. Most preterists would strongly argue to the pre-70 AD date of writing, so the 60s, during the time of Nero's persecution. Simply because they see that the main focus of Revelation, or one of the main focuses of Revelation, is the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And because they believe this to be inspired prophecy, it needs to be written before the events described, prophesied. And so they would place it, of all the views, they were the one most strongly holding on to the 60s view, Nero's persecution. There are some differences within this camp. There would be some who say you have the beginning point with the letters, but then all of this book, including the millennium, including the new heaven and new earth, all of it is connected to the fall of Jerusalem. So all of it has happened. All of Revelation has already taken place. Or there will be some who say, well, the main body of the letter is involved with the fall of Jerusalem, and then the millennium and new heaven, new earth is talking about eternity, the end. So this part has not yet been fulfilled. There are also another large group of preterists who see a split in the middle of the book. That the first half of the book is a prophecy against Jerusalem, but the second half is a prophecy against Rome. So again, it's still in the past, but it's not just about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's also all about the fall of the Roman Empire and the city of Rome in particular. Because they believe that for the most part, Revelation has already happened, they would say the relevance to the modern reader would be the same as all other prophetic books. So Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, etc. i.e. that most of the events of those books have been already fulfilled, but some elements of future prophecy may yet be fulfilled. Of course, to the original readers, this is highly relevant. And in fact, of all of the views, this really is the most relevant to the original readers, because it's talking about events that will happen in their time, in their day. Its relevance after the event would be in the same way that the letter of Corinthians or Romans is relevant to us, i.e. it wasn't written to us, so the events described in it are not about us, but there's so much in those books that we can learn to apply to our own life. And so preterists will say, Revelation wasn't written to us, the events have already happened, so they're not relevant to us in that sense, but there's so much in the book that we can learn from it and apply to our lives. All of this gives preterists the great luxury of all the views of not having to get in interpretive twists about when Jesus says, I am coming soon, or what soon must take place, or do not steal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. Passages like them throughout the book are simple for preterists, because they are about the fall of Jerusalem or the fall of Rome, which did happen soon, after the writing of the book. So Jesus was coming soon for them, it to judge Jerusalem or to judge Jerusalem and then judge Rome. Another strong point for this view is the argument between the similarities between the visions in Revelation, especially in this first half of the main body of the book, and the fall of Jerusalem as described by Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian. Josephus was not a Christian, so it was highly unlikely that he would ever have read Revelation. So it's interesting that many of the descriptions of the fall of Jerusalem in his book is similar to some of the visions and prophecies within the book of Revelation. They also look a lot at the Gospels for the proof of their approach. Jesus, in fact, is quoted the most as evidence for the focus on Jerusalem. The biggest of these, of course, is the Olivet Discourses of Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21. In fact, these are often referred to as little apocalypses, since they share similar imagery to Revelation and appear to be about the same topic. So preterists like to point out that the fourth Gospel, John, does not contain a little apocalypse. There's no Olivet Discourse in John. And they simply say there was no need of one, because John had already written, or was planning to write, a big apocalypse, Revelation. And so they say that the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation are essentially about the same thing: the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the fall of Jerusalem. One of the main criticisms of this view, though, is this utter dependence it has on the early date of writing. If it were to be proven without doubt that John did write the letter in the 90s, then most of preterism would fall apart. Maybe those with focus on Rome might survive, but it would be very difficult to be a preterist if it was absolutely proven to be written in the 90s, because the book would cease then to become inspired predictive prophecy. Another criticism is its origins. Many trace modern preterism back to the Jesuit, Louis de Alcazar. And it is alleged that he came up with modern preterism to combat the historicist view of the reformers. So many would argue that preterism is just the Catholic Church's response to Protestant historicism. Because what it does, of course, by putting all the characters of the book in the past, it means that you cannot identify the beasts with the current pope and the current papal system in the way that the historicists did. And preterism is strong in the Catholic Church. Though, in its defense, if you look back to Eusebius and these other writings, something similar to what we now have today in preterism did exist before the Reformation period. So that this has been a legitimate view of Revelation and the Olivet Discourse way before the Reformation period.